Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Ahmed Moor and I'm a fellow at the Foundation. Today is October 21st, 2025, and I'm delighted to be here with Adam Horowitz. Adam's the managing editor of Mondoweiss, who probably most of the listeners to this podcast have seen over the course of the past 16, 17 years, almost 20 years from when Phil Weiss started it in 2006. But Adam, you've been at Mondoweiss since 2009, right?
Yeah. End of 2008.
Amazing. And that's when I first met Adam. I had the privilege of writing for you and really grew up in terms of thinking through lots of the work that I wanted to do with you and Phil as editors. Um, so just real briefly, I guess, because Adam doesn't, you don't want to talk about yourself too much, but I think your story is really fascinating. I love meeting people who've been engaged in Palestine advocacy, and in your case, it's been a lifetime commitment. So would you give me a little bit of background on how you got into Palestine advocacy work?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And first, it's great to see you, Ahmed, and it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. And yes, you're right. I don't love talking about myself. I think it's much less interesting than everything else we're going to talk about today. But some of it might be relevant. So just to say, I grew up in suburban Philadelphia in a conservative Zionist Jewish household. And for me, I started coming to an awareness around, really an awareness around Palestine, sort of towards my high school and college years, where I was starting to get politically engaged and activated in um, in certain ways on other issues. But of course, this was an issue that I thought I knew something about. I started to look at and quickly learned that everything I'd been taught growing up was either not true or only a small part of the story. And so then, in my college years and after, starting to get more politically engaged in, again, other issues, I started looking at Palestine. I started reading Palestinian authors, started learning the history that I had not been told growing up. And then it was really with the beginning of the Second Intifada in 2000 where I became actively politically engaged. At this point, I was in New York City and got involved in a anti-Zionist Jewish group called Jews Against the Occupation, which really became my, you know, college, postgraduate education and everything, and was really my first chance of getting to work in solidarity and as a close ally to Palestinian organizers themselves, who is really who I learned from. So I would say that's what I could share. I'm happy to talk more about it, but that was sort of my path from um, not knowing much to being actively engaged and having been actively engaged ever since.
I mean, it's a powerful story that you see recapitulated like in the current environment, right? I mean, lots of young Jewish people shaking off what they've learned, and I think the more of these stories that we hear, the more it may resonate for those who are going through the journey. But can you take us back to 2006 when I guess the second father kind of ended with a whimper, and Phil Weiss started the blog. Where were you and what was the media landscape at that time? So I think back at 2006 and I remember this stuff pretty clearly. But 2 years of a lot of Palestine solidarity front and center, at least in the media that I consume. And of course, there are big issues with that statement, but the Palestine solidarity, at least in the media, has made a turn, I think. It was a very different environment close to 20 years ago. What was it like?
So there's a lot to say here, and I will definitely tell the story of Phil and Mondoweiss, which is a very interesting story, very illuminating. But first, to answer your question, at this point in my life and work, I was in Philadelphia working at the American Friends Service Committee, the international office headquarters in Philadelphia, working on Palestine education and advocacy work. And at that point, to get to your question around the media landscape, this was the blog era of the internet. And it's really hard to even remember compared to what things are like now. But social media, as we know it now, really didn't exist yet. There was this network of blogs, which, if anything, were somewhat similar to maybe what you would consider like Substack newsletters today, where authors would write about whatever they want to write about. And it was very much like sort of diary type entries. And Mondoweiss started as one of these blogs. Now, Phil started it when he was on staff at a newspaper in New York called the New York Observer. And he was a staff writer at the Observer, and he had his staff blog where he wrote about anything he wanted. So if you go to Mondoweiss now and go back through our archives, it's all still there on the site. You'll notice in the early days of Mondoweiss, it was about what Phil was watching on TV, random things he was thinking about anything, and increasingly Palestine, because this was an issue that he was getting interested and involved in. And so, as I started as a consumer of Mondoweiss, as at this point an activist of several years who was extremely already put off by mainstream media, its discussion of Palestine, and then suddenly finding this blog, this website from this seemingly mainstream journalist in New York City who was talking about the right of return, who was talking about the movement within Jewish life to undo Zionism, was talking about his trip to Palestine and what he saw in Hebron. And it honestly blew my mind. I didn't understand that there were mainstream journalists who were thinking this, seeing this, and Mondoweiss became one of the early places where people were congregating. There was other ones as well. I mean, and we can kind of name them. They haven't continued all this time. But well, before I could say how I got then involved, one of the important parts of Mondoweiss's history is it started at the New York Observer, and then someone named Jared Kushner bought the New York Observer. At this point, no one knew who Jared Kushner was. Of course, now we all know who Jared Kushner is. But at that point, he was just a 20-something son of a millionaire, who bought the New York Observer, already had staunch Zionist politics at that time, and fired Phil over his Israel reporting, over his Palestine politics. And because blogs at that time were a dime a dozen, said you could keep the blog. So Phil was no longer working at the New York Observer, but still had Mondoweiss and was working on it just on his own when I reached out to him one day looking for a new project. We had met once very briefly, and he invited me in, and I soon became his partner, and we were working on it together. So yes, I left my job at the American Friends Service Committee at the end of 2008 and started working on Mondoweiss.
And that was a courageous move. I mean, the landscape was so hostile to everything that you guys had to say. And back then it was mostly Phil, I think, who was doing the writing, and you were editing as well and commissioning writers.
Yeah.
But I remember early on discovering I was working in New York and coming across the Mondoweiss website, which was hosted on WordPress, I think, back then, and really just almost reeling. I was in shock. It was you guys, Amira Haas and Gideon Levy, who were writing in English about what was happening in Palestine, and nobody else. I mean, there was Rabbi Brant Rosen was writing some really revelatory stuff, but it was shocking. It was shocking to see, like you said, a mainstream journalist, and then Adam Horowitz, somebody who must be Jewish, I thought, writing this. It was almost profanity, right? I mean, and how shocking it was.
Yeah. No, and I think one of the interesting observations to think back over these last 20 years, and again, Mondoweiss, and of course, I have to mention Electronic Intifada, which was a foundational influence on me, began several years before Mondoweiss did. So there was already this model out there of this alternative media around Palestine that can be created. And I know it's something that certainly inspired me in wanting to take up this work. So it's important to mention them. But also, we're at this moment, I remember and I think this is probably still, I could probably look this up if I go to Twitter or X now, joining Twitter in 2009, I believe, when this first surge of interest came on, and starting to kind of connect the dots and getting news over social media in a way that didn't exist before. But the media landscape, whether it's alternative media like Mondoweiss or through social media, completely did broke through the gatekeeping role that the mainstream media or places like the New York Times played, still plays, whether it's NPR, the Washington Post, all these sort of mainstream media, which for even up until the mid 2000s was really one of the few easy places there was to get news. And of course, we know how horribly they cover Palestine. Suddenly, we had these other outlets, so like with reporting from the ground, and as the internet developed a little more, having firsthand video of what was happening on the ground in Palestine. I'm thinking about this going back just the weekend. Before we were recording this, there was these shocking videos of settler attacks against elderly Palestinians carrying out the olive harvest. I mean, that was the type of information that now, and especially after 2 years of watching a live stream genocide take place, these are all images that are incredibly impactful. And we can talk about this a little bit later. But 20 years ago, it didn't exist in the same way. And so having outlets like Mondoweiss and EI, and then the proliferation of social media, really just blew open this information that was previously unavailable and that people were incredibly hungry for.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up EI. Actually, I mean, because when I was writing for you guys back in 2009, I was also writing for EI, but I don't want to understate the impact that seeing, again, a mainstream Jewish American journalist had on me speak about Palestine. When you're in your own group, EI was founded by Ali Abu Na'man, lots of Palestinian writers. There's not that same revelatory. Of course, they see it. They're just like I am. And so for me, again, Mondoweiss played a really important role in socializing me around the idea of solidarity, that there are people out there who aren't kind of tribalistic in their thinking. Um, and I mean that about all of us. So Operation Cast Lead,
Yeah.
2009, the Israelis bombed Gaza, killed 1,400 people. There aren't enough synonyms for the word shock in English. At the time, I was, I think, like lots of people, just anguished at the images coming out of Gaza. And that was also an important inflection point, or maybe a seminal moment in the public awareness around what was happening in Gaza. Is that right?
That's completely true. And that's actually what I was just about to say previously in kind of taking us up to this moment in in history. Because I mean, so again, I joined Mondoweiss at the end of 2008, and Cast Lead starts the next month. And I think from that moment on, it's just been sort of a roller coaster of news. But this last 20 years has been marked by these horrible moments of Israeli onslaught on Gaza, and Cast Lead was one of was the first of this series, and of course, was shocking, exactly like what you said, and led to this moment. The Goldstone Report, which was a UN report that South African jurist Richard Goldstone put out. Mondoweiss, Phil, me, and our co-editor Lizzie Ratner put out a book about the Goldstone Report, which at this point was this again one of these incredibly shocking accountings of Israel's barbarity in Gaza. Of course, everything at this point now pales in comparison to what we've witnessed over these last 2 years, but Cast Lead 2008, 2009, and then 2014 and 2021. There's been this recurring just Israeli onslaughts, which I think, which we've taken upon ourselves to document. And I do think that our archives and the archives of many other of our allies in this have become just incredibly important in documenting this era of history. And I think have all led up to this moment and this awareness that now exists around what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Palestine, what Zionism is all about. But yeah, Kessled was really the moment that Mondoweiss kind of grew up a bit and sort of transitioned from being this very personal blog into much more of a journalistic enterprise.
And so would you describe, I want to get to the movement in a moment, but would you describe how the readership has changed over time, but also the journalists, because now there are many more Palestinian voices presented on the Mondoweiss website on a very regular basis, original reporting out of Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, and so when I give this thumbnail history, sometimes it starts with at the beginning of Mondoweiss, everything on the site was written by one of two people, either me or Phil. And now, I mean, I don't write at all, and Phil writes very occasionally. But Mondoweiss itself now has a staff of 10 people. We have published, I think at last count, over 1,500 people from around the world, and our current staff is half based in Palestine, half based here. All of our reporting from on the ground in Palestine is done by Palestinian reporters. And again, like we've grown as an institution or as an organization to allow us to do this. But actually, going back to Cast Led, it was really one of those first moments where we started reaching out to writers from based in Gaza just to tell their story, to write these first person kind of diary entries and really trying to insert and like, I guess what I've always viewed our role as being, or partly my role, is to build a platform within the US Western discourse to bring the Palestinian voice that has been excluded, to inject that into the discourse. And so, I mean, for so long, and I know that you probably remember this as well, and this is still sadly the case, so often Palestine as an issue is discussed without Palestinians. Palestinian voices, Palestinian aspirations, Palestinian visions for freedom and liberation are not included. Honestly, way too often, it's usually just a group of Jewish people talking about Palestine. And so from the very beginning of Mondoweiss, we've sought to reject that and sort of use some of our standing. And it's interesting to hear you say that. And I completely understand the way that you experienced this fact that we were Jewish and being critical of Zionism. And I obviously don't want to discount that. And I get that. At the same time, and it's funny, if Phil was here with me now, we've been fighting about this for 20 years. So like I've always sought to really sort of reject that. And I understand that that's a reality. I think it's a reality that I think about our work as trying to undo, is that the Jewish voice should not have this place of privilege in the conversation, which it certainly used to, I would say, more, and this is changing. This is, I think, some of the work that we've been involved in. But really, one of the ways that we've sought to do that is this transformation that you've identified too, that whereas Mondoweiss really did start as this kind of Jewish conversation around some of these topics, we've certainly looked to open that up and diversify and undo that. I
Well,
mean,
so I mean,
yeah,
I agree with everything that you've said there. But I also want to say those early blog posts by Phil Weiss reflecting on Jewish power in America, the attainment of acceptance into kind of elite society after Protestant white culture society, I guess, opened
yeah,
up to permit that integration. That was really kind of a valuable education for me, and I think for lots of people. The
was for me
ways in
too.
which,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with you. And, Phil and I are of different generations. So Phil is about 20 years older than me. And so reading his analysis of how we got to this point, well, you were just describing, I found incredibly helpful to me understanding like what this kind of sociological transformation what had been in the Jewish community, say, in the generation before I came along. And this transformation has only continued. So yeah, no, I completely agree with you.
So I just a quick note on dehumanization. I mean, there's an argument or an assumption implicit in your statement that you wanted to solicit more Palestinian voices. And that assumption is that people would care or they'd be interested in what somebody coming from Gaza had to say. And in my experience, kind of what I've seen is that's not always true. That the person with the South Asian sounding name or the East Asian sounding name or the Arabic sounding name will have their perspective discounted, and may not be taken as seriously. Um, so how do you justify that assumption? Is that something that you've run up against as well? And it's a question about dehumanization, really.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what you're saying, except that I would say that that dehumanization is what we need to be pushing back against. I mean, this is all discussion around. I mean, I'm sure it's been a conversation here on this podcast. Who has the permission to narrate? Edward Said's famous essay. Yes, that is true. And yes, this is part of the social change that we've been involved in. And I say we as Mondoweiss, and I think more broadly, that Palestinians are the experts around the Palestinian condition. I mean, again, it feels so simple to say at this point, although we both know this is still contested. But this is work that we've been engaged in. So I agree with what you're saying, but I would never want to and think that none of us should accept this as the way things they might be the way things are, but not the way things should be. And when I look back about and I would never there's nothing that I would take credit for or that Mondoweiss is responsible for. No. But we have been part of this movement moving forward, where I do think that this is something that has changed over these last 20 years. It's not where we want it to be yet, of course, but the role and acceptance of um, Palestinian voices and perspectives and leadership on these issues is completely different than it was 20 years ago. I was actually just talking to some of my colleagues at Mondoweiss about this, and I'm trying to remember which of the years it was, but I remember you look back through Mondoweiss's archives, like when the term Nakba started getting commonly used in US media was only in this last period, was probably 15 years ago or 10 years ago. Before that, even having the name Nakba as a point of reference for the ethnic cleansing and creation of in 1948 of the state of Israel and the intentional dispossession and displacement of the Palestinian people, whereas that history might have been generally known, that very simple even self-definition of it did not exist in the Western discourse.
Mhm.
Um, Obviously, Mondoweiss does not take credit for that, but Mondoweiss, along with this wave of alternative media, was part of the process in changing the discourse. And so I think it's really hard to think back to as bad as things feel right now, and they're not good. They were worse, and I think alternative media around Palestine has been part of the element, in addition to the incredible growth of the Palestine movement at large that has really forced this issue into the popular consciousness, which has been led by Palestinians.
So that's a great segue to the movement itself.
Yeah,
You've been involved in the movement. You've been at Mondoweiss. I'm going to do some quick sloppy math. 16 years,
yeah,
and you were involved with Palestine organizing and Palestine work at AFSC before that.
yeah.
And so 2 decades in the movement. Um, as a professional, what's happened? What have you seen? And then I want to challenge the idea that we're on an upward trajectory, which isn't something that you've stated, but
Yeah,
sometimes feels like it's out there. Cast lead. There was a lot of energy around it, and then we went back to this kind of interminable grind that
yeah,
Israel's really perfected in the occupied territories. So we know that there's an effort now to claim that the genocide is over. There's a
yeah,
ceasefire in place. Let's rehabilitate Israel. The Callis, I may be mispronouncing her name, but the EU, anyways, the EU person has come out and said that sanctions, the whole discussion of sanctions related to Israel, that's being tabled for now. That's being suspended for now because there's a ceasefire in her telling. So yeah, where's the movement gone? Is there a risk that we're going to move back, uh, despite which would hurt a lot because there's been so much sacrifice and
yeah.
destruction, and you want accountability.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic, and it's one that I'm very interested in. And yeah, we could talk about it for hours. One thing I was going to mention earlier when talking about this like period of time in Mondoweiss starting in 2006, um, is that one of the seminal moments too around, not formally around its creation, because it wasn't, but I do think it's one of the bookends of this period of time was 2005 with the creation of the BDS movement. I'm sure I don't know if this is a history that's been shared on the podcast already, but in 2004, the International Court of Justice hands down this advisory opinion against the apartheid wall, the separation wall in the West Bank, calling on the international community to take action. A year goes by, and in July of 2005, Palestinian civil society says, because no action's been taken, we are now launching the BDS movement run by, under the leadership of Palestinian civil society. And it was this incredibly inspiring moment that really began to change the discourse around Palestine, I would say within the Palestine movement. Because for the first time in a long time, there was this joint list of demands, and was also a joint list of demands that connected the situation of Palestinians inside 48 territories, in the occupied territories, and in the diaspora at large, including the demand for the right of return, that really helped reorient and do an incredible, before any activism or organizing happened, there was this internal education that the BDS movement's call really helped establish and make concrete. And so, in many ways, when I think about the stories that we've been telling over these 20 years, one of those stories has been the growth of the BDS movement, which has not been the totality of the Palestine movement in the US or around the world, but it has been sort of, I would say, almost like a spine of it in terms of ways that people have been engaged, whether it's on campus or in their churches or in their areas, places of worship, or just in society at large. And so watching that movement grow, and along with it, especially the movement on campuses, is really something that I think is in a lot of ways coming to a head right now. The BDS movement, both the repression it's facing as well as the victories that it is now sustaining. I just remember in the early days of the BDS movement, just thinking, there would be these campus votes on divestment, and at first they would all inevitably fail. And just remembering, getting so excited for each one, and then they would fail at the student senate. Now, of course, these votes get passed with regularity. There's still a challenge getting schools to put them into effect, but the movement has grown, and the power of the movement has grown to such a extent that I would say the scale is completely different. That being said, and I guess I should have also said at the beginning that everything we're talking about here is just me. This is just my opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of Mondoweiss. I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone. So these are some of just my own personal thoughts around this. When I think about the movement work over the last 20 years, I do see this incredible growth. And there's these things we can talk about, just the profound level of social change that has taken place in the United States around Palestine, which I think is very real. And I believe, irreversible. That being said, as someone who's been involved in this movement for the last 25 years, I can't help but see the events of the last 2 years, meaning the genocide in Gaza, as just being like a failure of such just profound, such a profound failure that I don't even have the words for it. I mean, and of course, for as long as I've been involved in this and long I've been involved in movement work, um, learning about 1948, talking about the Nakba, remembering the Nakba, understanding the political visions and demands that come out of that experience, I don't think that there were enough spaces that I was in. I'm speaking for the movement at large, but spaces that I was in that understood that this could happen again, and that there really could be a catastrophe, either as large or even larger than what happened in 1948. And I would say that if we had adopted it anything as a mission for our movement, part of that mission would have been to make sure that that never happens again. And that is something that we have failed at. And so I do think that the movement has grown enormously, and the has opened so many new sort of horizons of possibility for what we could accomplish. And it also has to be said that the movement had sort of it failed at the moment it was needed the most. And that's something that I actually want to do some more thinking around, and that I know that as someone who's been around for this period, I really carry with me. Um, that being said, we are in this moment right now, and I can't necessarily recite them off the top of my head, but I'm sure you've seen them. But just now, poll after poll after poll, we see in the United States that the widespread support for an arms embargo on Israel, the overwhelming support for Palestinians over Israelis, the criminality that we have seen over these last 2 years, repeatedly, in addition to the work of our alternative media, in addition to the work of this movement, I do believe has forever altered the way that this issue is viewed, both in the United States and around the world. That does not mean that things are going to materially change. Like, what our challenge is now is to take the shifting understanding and these shifting attitudes and turn them into political power, to turn these attitudes into material change. Um, it's been a lot of work to change the attitudes. I think the next phase of what we're talking about is going to dwarf that, and by a magnitude. So I think in many ways where we've come as a movement over these last 20 years is incredible, and I also think we're just starting.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that summary, and I appreciate your taking time to highlight the, I would call it, inadequacy of the movement to prevent what I'm increasingly beginning to conclude was kind of inevitable. I mean, you highlighted 2005 as the moment when BDS as an organized effort was founded. 2006 was Dahi Doctrine in southern Lebanon. The idea that you kill tens of civilians in order to kill one militant, um, children, innocents, whomever. That really became enshrined. I think it's always been the MO of the Israeli military, but it became enshrined within the doctrine of the military in 2006, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
And we've seen the way in which that doctrine, the Dahi doctrine, Dahi is a neighborhood in Lebanon and Beirut, became the fullest expression of the genocide. 300, 400, 500 people killed in a day through incessant bombing, because the Israelis claim that there's a Hamas militant somewhere in the mix. And so I want to transition to the question of accountability. I mean, the the Hind Rajab Foundation, Al Jazeera, today, I think, came out and identified who the 24 men who participated in the murder of Hind Rajab and her family. What is our next step as a movement? One, I guess, both in terms of protection, but second, in terms of accountability.
Yeah. I mean, this is the question. And this is a question that I think um, you, all of us, I mean, this is a generational question. This is a question that's going to take probably the rest of my lifetime to be working on and enacting. I think it's a really challenging question, partly because we've all seen over these last 2 years, so much of what the genocide has helped uncover is the not only the inadequacy, but the complicity of our institutions, our international bodies. Um, to the point that, I mean, one of the reasons I find the work of the Hind Rajab Foundation so inspiring is really is civil society that is having to step into the breach because um, the world, the West's rules order um, not only is unable to, because it's perfectly able to, but it's unwilling to hold its own accountable. And so then I do think, and you said earlier in terms of this moment that we're in, where there's this pause, not even a pause in the genocide. We're in this moment where there's the ceasefire. So we're not at a point yet where we're talking about after the genocide. We are still in the genocide. Um, but there will be a day where we will be after the genocide. And I do think it will become a question for us as a movement, but also for us as humanity in terms of how to hold those accountable, whether they be Israeli, whether they be in the US government or other European governments who were complicit in carrying out this genocide. How will that happen? And I mean, I don't know the answer to that question other than it is at the top of our agenda, and I would not be surprised if this does lead to another moment like the end of World War II that leads to the creation of new institutions because the institutions that we have been living with, in this period have been just woefully inadequate. And I almost hesitate to say that because I actually think they're doing their job as designed, but their job as designed is I think not acceptable to the overwhelming majority of humanity. And so this is one of our challenges moving forward.
So, within the Palestine liberation movement, and I count myself amongst these people, you kind of you look at things like the No Kings protest, the anti-Trump agitation, and you kind of breathe a weary sigh, and you go, "Where were you people? What is No Kings in the context of a genocide? What is this kind of liberal silliness?" And I saw a placard on Twitter that read, "If Kamala was elected, we'd be at brunch now," or something really inane like that.
Yes.
So, so I guess my question to you is, from a domestic political point of view, what are the ways in which the movement for Palestinian liberation can interact with the Rump Democratic Party, and what needs to happen for electoral politics to make a meaningful change on this question on Palestinian liberation? Or is that even the right assumption? Is that the avenue that we have available to us to make a meaningful difference in the next decade?
Yeah. So I think a number of things about this. Um, One of which is, I'm sitting here, I'm based in Atlanta in the US. I know you're in the US. Um, the US is never going to be in the lead on this issue. When we look at, it's this really interesting dynamic that, we ran a story last year at the anniversary of the Nakba that by Dr. Raja Karmi, who's writing from London. And one of the things that she wrote about was this, like, kind of an apology to, I mean, and she's Palestinian, an apology to Palestinians uh, in Palestine for this sort of hubristic thought that she and other Palestinians in the diaspora had thought that Palestine was going to be liberated from the outside, that Palestine was going to be liberated from the West. And this is something that was not uncommon in movement spaces when I was first getting involved. That this idea, and there's an organization that I was the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights, I believe is what it's currently called. When it was first started, but 25 years ago, it was called the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation. Edward Said and a lot of other notable people were part of the creation of that. And the idea around the start of that was if we were able to change US policy here, then then the occupation couldn't continue. That basically the change needs to happen in the US and then it will flow down. I think one of the things that we've seen repeatedly during this period is that Palestine, whether from the Intifadas or even what we've seen over these last 2 years, that Palestine is going to be liberated most likely from resistance in Palestine, resistance in the region, and that our role here in the US is to support that however we can. And that is where things like the BDS movement comes in. Like there's a role for people to play internationally, and it is to participate through things like BDS. It's to participate through actions like an organization like Palestine Action and direct action around arms suppliers and things like that. But that Palestine is not going to be and cannot be liberated through our activities here in the US. Um, that also, though, means that there is a role for us in terms of challenging this political support that exists. I think that it's a growing effort. It's, there's Palestine reveals so much around the world order and world politics. One of the things that it has also, has shown us over these last 2 years is there was overwhelming voter support for a ceasefire. There's overwhelming voter support for an arms embargo. Um, Actual voter attitudes does very little to influencing our actual representatives. And so when we're talking about doing electoral work in Washington, D.C., and I really appreciate and applaud the parts of the movement that take it on, we are working on a battlefield where we don't have the resources that we need to be able to actually compete, which is honestly money. We've seen this in whether it's AIPAC or other parts of the Israel lobby that is able to raise and bundle donations to representatives that are basically able to buy their support. That is just starting to crack now. I mean, one of the things we've seen just even in this past week are Democratic representatives who are starting to refuse money from AIPAC because AIPAC itself has become so politically toxic in the Democratic Party. So I think it is a real challenge to think about doing that kind of electoral work in the US. I also think that that kind of like government engagement work is going to be more successful pretty much everywhere else in the world before it is successful here. Similar to apartheid in South Africa, the US government, the Reagan administration, was the last country to stop supporting apartheid in South Africa. I think it's going to be very similar that the US government is the last government to stop supporting apartheid and ethnic cleansing in Palestine, which isn't to say we shouldn't stop doing this work, but that we should be really looking to other parts of the world for that kind of inspiration. And we're seeing it through efforts like the Hague Group, which is this coalition that's being organized through something called Progressive International, which is organizing state bodies to start look at this question of what does accountability look like, trying to support actions at the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the US is seeking to sanction these kind of efforts. They're not seeking to support them. But that's some of what we're up against here in the US. I mean, we're truly in the belly of the beast. And so I think part of our work here is to support these efforts outside and try to move what we can inside.
I want to talk about cultural boycott because for me that seems like the most available locus of change or lever. And not only is it available, it's probably the one which is going to have the most meaningful impact in the near term, to my mind. You hear arguments against cultural boycott. You know, Israel is a pluralistic society. There are lots of different currents within that society. Not everybody supports the genocide. 14 out of every 100 people do not support the genocide. And so, what's the basis for calling for a cultural boycott? So, do you support the cultural boycott? Is it really a point of leverage? And if so, can you explain your thinking there?
Yeah. Yes, I completely support the cultural boycott, and this includes whether it's an academic boycott, sports boycott, all these sort of elements. And it really does get to, I mean, what I was just talking about in my last answer are the arenas in which we don't have power for whatever reason that is. But when you talk about the cultural boycott, you are talking about you're entering the arena in which we do have power, which is moral power, which is ethical power, which is the ability to, as a community that is worldwide, to name and shame what is happening in Israel, what is happening in the name of Zionism, and to say to draw a moral and ethical line that this does not stand. This isn't necessarily saying that everybody in this society is guilty, although there is an argument that there is overwhelming support within Israeli society for what we've been seeing, especially amongst Israeli Jews. But that is a somewhat irrelevant question. The question is, what do we as an international civil society want to sanction? What do we want to support? And where can we do our best to stand in the way? The cultural boycott is our way of being able to stand in the way to say normal life cannot continue while this abnormal assault on life is taking place, be it the genocide in Gaza, the expanding ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, or the general oppression of the Palestinian people since before 1948 under the name of Zionism. So I really just think it's as simple as that. One of the successes that we have seen in the movement is whether it's through things like boycott or whether it's through things as just like locking arms and standing in the street, it's important that we send a message to both our leaders, but to the world that this is not acceptable and that there will not be business as usual while this inhumane system continues.
So thank you, and I appreciate that answer, and I agree fully. To me, the idea of collective punishment is an important one, but I also think proportionality is important, and in thinking through um, encouraging a society to de-radicalize and behave in ways that correspond to norms of ordinary human conduct in the 21st century. One nonviolent effort which should be supported is the cultural boycott. And it's predicated on the assumption that there are enough good Israelis, Jewish Israelis, who will say, "Hey, wait, I care about being a member of the, community of nations, and if this is what it takes to rejoin that community, then I'm prepared to push for change from within." So I appreciate your message and the moral clarity that comes across there. Um, the work of doing doing Palestine solidarity work can be pretty isolating, and I think I know Phil Weiss because he wrote about it. Um, but I want to ask you to reflect on the past 25 years. I mean, I imagine that there was a closing of some of your social circle. Has that changed now? I mean, there are groups like If Not Now and all of the other Palestine JVP, which isn't to presume anything about your social circle. But do you feel that the social space, the ability to breathe in civil society has changed through the genocide? And is that a source of support for you and others in the movement?
Um, things have completely changed, and there's a little anecdote that I can tell about this, but yeah, I mean, I will just say that to sort of answer your question first, sort of more broadly, is you know taking a political position outside of like the mainstream is always going to involve some degree of social isolation. I would say that was maybe more true for Phil than it was for me in my generation, and it's even, changing for people who are younger than me. I will say though too that this is also one of the roles and impacts of the movement. So for, whatever I lost, which I honestly can't even it's not even meaningful to me at this point. Um, I certainly more than gained in the community of like-minded people that I met through the movement. So I should say, for me, I never felt sort of isolated or alone in any of my beliefs because I was, always sort of surrounded by people who I was building with and, shared perspectives with. I will say though, but I was also, of course, aware that, beliefs that I might have held around Palestine certainly put me in a minority in certain spaces I was in. I will say one thing that's interesting now, as a parent of teenagers, I'll say, is that observing them, and of course, they know what I do. We talk about things. I wouldn't say that they're, overly interested in what I do. It comes up. But in talking to them and seeing the conversation that happens amongst their friends, in their social world, um, being pro-Palestinian is the common sense perspective. It is just sort of like, as somebody who is not even super engaged in politics, but just of someone who cares about the world, you stand with Palestinians. I feel like this sort of idea of what is considered common sense around Palestine has completely shifted in this period. And I mean, this goes back before even just the last 2 years. But I do think, at least just what I'm seeing anecdotally, that a lot of this sort of social isolation that you might have been describing, is just very different today than it was certainly 20 years ago, probably even maybe 10 years ago, where the people are just overwhelmingly with us. And by us, meaning people who care about Palestinian freedom. It's become a common sense position to have. Again, there's still going to be the challenge of building that into actual political power. Yes. But what might have once felt like a really isolated place to be, I don't think any longer feels that way.
Thank you to Adam Horowitz, the managing editor of Mondoweiss, somebody I've known now for, wow, 17 years and have admired for all of that time. I'm so grateful to you for spending an hour with me today describing the growth in the movement and also the indispensable media work that you all have done for so long. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you for having me.